I'm a big fan of zombie movies, always have been. Since the 80s, when I used to see them on the Saturday Shocker and the Thriller Double Feature, I've been a rabid fan of the undead. So I decided, for my first video where I talk, I'd do a little movie thing about the top 10 zombie movies ever. First, to define the criteria for the list of best zombie movies, to me, zombie means reanimated corpse, a human who has died and been brought back to life to terrorize the living, usually by eating their flesh, sometimes specifically their brain. How they come back to life varies. Black magic, cosmic rays, some noxious chemical, but the key element is that they are the undead, mindless, flesh-eating monsters. With that in mind, I've left most of the bio-zombie movies off the list. The ones where the zombies are not really dead, but rather infected with some virus that makes them attack the uninfected. I'll accept on the list movies like that where the infected humans attempt to eat the survivors, since that's the defining zombie trait, but I'm excluding movies like 28 Days Later, which is a great movie and played a key role in fanning the zombie resurgence, but the zombies in it aren't zombies by my definition because they don't want to eat the living. This would also apply to an excellent film like Cooties in 2014 or World War Z, which I thought was really overhyped anyway. Same goes for I Am Legend, outstanding movie. I believe Will Smith's best performance as an actor, but the infected aren't zombies by our definition, so I'm not putting them on the list. Oh, by the way, you know where these rules come from? Me! I make them up. Neat deal. That's my show. Anyway, further defining the list. There are a lot of other good movies that don't quite meet the criteria in other ways. Evil Dead, for example, great movie, but it's more of a demon possession movie than a zombie movie, although all three were outstanding, and the remake was okay too. 2 out of 5 of the segments of my favorite anthology, Creepshow, has zombies, but that's not even half about zombies, and the zombies in question want revenge, not to eat people, so that one's out. Reanimator, I think, belongs more under Lovecraft lore than zombie apocalypse, even though I do love it, as much as I love the other Gordon Lovecraft movies of that era, so it's missing from the list. Serpent and the Rainbow is great, but it's only tinged with zombie elements, as the main plot is about voodoo. Dead Heat is fantastic. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It checks most of the boxes too, but there is no apocalypse, no flesh eating, and it's more of a buddy cop dark comedy than a zombie movie. Another good one is Fido, but it's also more comedy, and that brings me to other films that I'm leaving off the list. I kept the list to fairly serious movies, although some contain comical or satirical elements. Most comedies, which are intended as deconstructs of zombie movies, I left off. The best example, of course, is Shaun of the Dead. Great movie, fun to pick out all the genre references to the films they're lampooning, but that's not what the list is about, so still a great movie. If you're interested in zombies, you probably know all about Shaun of the Dead, and the title is a clever play on George Romero's Dawn of the Dead masterpiece, but did you know there's another one called Juan of the Dead? Yeah, really funny movie with the same premise, and it has the distinction of being the first Cuban zombie movie. So zombies of the world unite. Good. More shout outs to zombie comedies. My Boyfriend's Back, really good. Hilarious if you like funny horror comedy kind of films, but not for our list. Okay, one last caveat before we started. I omitted the really old zombie movies, like 1932's White Zombie and 1943's I Walked Home with a Zombie, where the zombies are basically just played by actors with wide eyes and stiff movements, and again, no eating people. Those are cool to see as part of the prehistory of zombie films, but to put them on a list like this would be like when people try to tell you the Kinks are the first heavy metal band because they invented distortion for guitars, and that might be part of the foundation, but Black Sabbath's the first heavy metal band. Don't be ridiculous. Okay, after that long preamble, here's the list. Oh, first, some shout-outs to the number 11, the honorable mention, the films that didn't quite make the top 10, the Blind Dead trilogy, Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, Redneck Zombies, Dead Snow, both the direct DVD Dead Rising movies, all good, but they can't all be top 10, so honorable mention to those guys, and on we go. Number 10, Plague of the Zombies, 1966. Probably not much of a spoiler to tell you that Night of the Living Dead is on this list, but since we're going chronologically from oldest to newest, it's probably a surprise that it's not first. But this movie actually came out 2 years earlier. It's the first zombie apocalypse movie I know of to feature makeup, where the zombies are not just actors with powdered white and wide eyes. They actually use special makeup effects to make the undead look undead in this one. It's set in the English countryside, where a mad scientist who's studied voodoo in Haiti is raising dead people to make an undead slave labor force. It's one of the original Hammer films, and it's a real forgotten gem for zombie fans. So, if you have Turner Classics, set your DVR. It probably shows in their late night show fairly regularly. Number 9, Night of the Living Dead, 1968. What can you say about this one? I mean, this was the midnight movie, the little indie film from Pittsburgh that became a phenomenon. It was panned by critics for being too gory, and by 1968 standards, it really was pretty shocking. It still had people lining up around the block to see it, though, grossing 120 times its budget domestically alone. In addition to being the definitive zombie apocalypse movie, director and co-writer George Romero's use of imagery and subtle social messaging in this is nothing short of brilliant. He wrapped it all up in a truly first-rate horror movie. It inspired a slew of sequels and remakes, some of which are also on this list. And in 1999, it was honored by the Library of Congress by being placed in the National Film Registry, with other films deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The reason you've probably seen it on network TV, or one of the nearly 200 different editions released across VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray, is that the original distributor failed to file the copyright paperwork correctly, and the film went public domain. Anyway, if you haven't seen it, I can't recommend it highly enough. This is the Gone with the Wind of zombie movies. Number 8, Day of the Dead, 1978. The first sequel to Night of the Living Dead is one of those times where you would have trouble believing the first one could be topped, but it was. It's set in the breakdown of society after the zombie apocalypse in the original. Dawn of the Dead follows some survivors who find temporary safety in a shopping mall until some marauding bikers show up who want the mall for themselves, and they have to fight them and the zombies at the same time. This one pushed the standard of shock and gore in 78, just like Night of the Living Dead did in 68. And again, Romero's clever use of symbolism and social satire make the film compelling underneath its action horror appeal. In addition to inspiring the fantastic remake by Zack Snyder in 2004, it's also the basis for the game that made me go out and buy an Xbox 360, Dead Rising. Number 7, Zombie, 1979. Here the naming conventions kind of get tricky. In 1978, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead was recut by Dario Argento and rescored by Goblin, and it was released in Italy as Zombie, Z-O-M-B-I, no E, where it was a big hit. There's a thing in Italian copyright law at the time that allows for making a sequel about characters when you have no connection to the original film, so an Italian producer bankrolled just that. And this time the director was Lucio Fulci. The story follows a young woman trying to find her missing scientist father, who she tracks to the remote Caribbean island that he was working on after his boat turns up in New York Harbor with a zombie in it. It turns out he's been on this remote Caribbean island trying to stop a zombie outbreak, and well, as often is the case, that didn't go well. Anyway, it's a fun movie with some very impressive for the time gore and effects, including a scuba diver, portrayed by Oretta Gay, being attacked by zombies on the ocean floor, and the attack being broken up by a shark attack in the middle of it. It's lots of fun. Anyway, that was 1979 when it was released in Italy as Zombie 2, because, the original was the Dawn of the Dead recut. But they then dubbed the film in English and released it in the United States as just Zombie, Z-O-M-B-I-E. With the classic iconic poster you've probably seen in other movies or on a big deluxe VHS box in the 80s at your local video store like I did. The score from Fabio Frizzi is fantastic, by the way. Number 6, Night of the Comet, 1984. This one I debated a while because the word zombie is never actually said in it, and the zombies are not the huge horde we're used to seeing in zombie apocalypse films. However, they are there, and they do eat people. The story, like many in this genre, borrows some from I Am Legend. This time, the world-killing event is a comet that passes too close to Earth, disintegrating most of the world's population. anyone in a steel structure when that happened, like the main characters, survive unscathed, while anyone who is in a non-steel structure is turned into a flesh-eating monster. The film follows a girl, her little sister, and a guy they meet adventure across the now empty cityscape as they try to elude a creepy bunch of scientists who knew this was all going to happen but failed to take steps to protect themselves in their secret bunker, who believe they need the kids' blood to survive and find a cure. Big time 80s fun, this movie, right? While it's not Dawn of the Dead, there is an apocalypse, there are zombies, and they do eat people, so this one fits our top 10 pretty well, despite lacking the budget to have huge swaths of undead extras. Number 5, Day of the Dead, 1985. George Romero goes back to the well in this one, the third entry into his Dead films canon. Just as Dawn is set years after night, this one is set years after dawn, where society is now completely collapsed, and the dead own the whole planet, basically. It takes place in a military bunker, where there are some soldiers and scientists holding out, as the scientists try to figure out what could be done about all this, and the soldiers are getting more and more paranoid and agitated about having to share their provisions with these civilians, who don't seem to be making much progress. As you can imagine, tensions boil over, and the groups turn on one another, and their conflict plays out in the crossfire of the zombie apocalypse. As Romero described the plot in an interview once, you got your good guys, you got your bad guys, you got your dead guys. In terms of gore, this one just went to insane levels. Tom Savini and his then understudy Greg Nicotero, Walking Dead fans should know that name, did amazing things with prosthetics for the zombies themselves, and when the zombies start eating people, whoa, shocking stuff. This movie made those two guys in the business. They were horror icons based on their work in this film. The film made a lot of money, especially on VHS, but it broke from the previous two in that it didn't get much respect from the critics. Roger Ebert hated it, which is usually a good way to predict I'll love something. He, among others, rated it poorly. I will concede that this is the last film in Romero's series that I thought was really good. I had high hopes for Land of the Dead, which came along in the 90s. Even though it had a great cast, it ended up falling flat. The films after that in the series, Diary of the Dead, Survival of the Dead, they're just plain bad. The remakes in this series, particularly for Night and Dawn, were very strong, but I only have 10 spots, and I don't feel like their derivative nature earns them a place above number 11. And so that is George Romero's last entry into our top 10. Number 4, Return of the Living Dead, 1985. The other seismic event in zombie films in 1985 was this one, the film that taught me how to dress as a teenager. It was loosely based on George Romero's Night of the Living Dead co-author John Russo's novel of the same name. How that worked out is Russo retained the rights to the phrase Living Dead, while Romero had the right to make direct sequels to Night of the Living Dead, which is why the Dawn and Day both have living missing from their title. This film was directed by Dan O'Bannon, who had struck gold with his script for Alien that he'd wrote a few years earlier. I know I said this isn't a list for comedies, but there is more than a little winking at the audience in this movie, but the way everyone plays their part, 100% committed, dead serious, it makes the film work. The film is set in a warehouse in Kentucky where an old warehouse worker is training a new young hire. The old guy, played by James Karen, reveals to his trainee that Night of the Living Dead was actually based on a true story, and that some of the real-life zombies that inspired that story were accidentally delivered to this warehouse in 1968, and that they're still there. So they go down in the basement to check this out, and the old guy raps on the side of the canisters housing the bodies. It ruptures, and the zombifying gas contained in with the corpses leaks out, and it starts a zombie outbreak there in Wichita. The warehouse owner and the workers and some punks partying in the cemetery next door suddenly find themselves in this life and death fight with the living dead, and it's an insanely wild ride. Great dialogue, characters, outstanding gore and makeup effects. This one really had it all. Also, they throw in a twist that the tried and true way to kill a zombie, the headshot, doesn't really work, and that the zombies are, for all intents and purposes, immortal. You can beat them down, they just keep getting back up. Anyway, this is a fantastic entry to the zombie genre, which inspired a whole slew of sequels, most of which had nothing or next to nothing to do with this one. Most of those were terrible. Although the third one was pretty good, I thought. Anyway, definitely this one belongs in any zombie top 10. Number 3, Night of the Creeps, 1986. This is where I'd put the demarcation point between the great zombie films of the 80s and 90s, and this was really the last good one. It's directed by Fred Decker, who mixes all the cool 50s horror cliches in a way that isn't comedic. They updates them to the 80s kinda, with a really likable cast, featuring a great performance by Tom Atkins from Halloween 3. The zombies in this one are animated by an alien experiment jettisoned on Earth. It's a canister of brain-eating slugs turned loose on a sleepy college campus. This one is a great time. Kind of think of it like if you combine Back to School with Day of the Dead. Number 2, Dead Alive, also known as Braindead, 1992. Before Peter Jackson won all those Academy Awards for the Hobbit movies, he made some fantastic low-budget horror films, like Bad Taste, Meet the Feebles, and this next one on our list, Braindead, originally titled Dead Alive in the United States, since there was already a movie here called Braindead. The story follows Lionel, who is living with his domineering mother, who ends up zombified after being bitten by a rare Sumatran rat monkey. Lionel tries to contain the situation, but the plague begins to spread as his mom starts killing and infecting anyone who visits, and before you know it, Lionel has to confront a whole horde of the undead, and stand up to his mother in the process, in a total bloodbath. Fantastic practical effects, great slapstick performances, it really sets this one off. And this is another gore milestone. This kind of puts Day of the Dead to shame in terms of buckets of blood and guts that you see flying. If you look for this, try and find the British or the Australian version, which were uncut. The original US version is missing almost 20 minutes, mostly of gore, although a later Blu-ray edition almost fully restored it. There's now been talk of a 4K release, and that Jackson might be involved in the actual recutting of it for 4K. I might buy a 4K TV if that were to happen. That's how good this one was. Okay, number 1, Zombieland, 2009. This is the one I mentioned earlier as an exception, since the zombies are technically not dead, but they behave as zombies in every way applicable, especially in eating people. The cause of the mutation of a mad cow disease being where we get the zombies in this film. It follows a narrator played by Jesse Eisenberg, who's a shy college kid making his way back east across a post-apocalyptic wasteland to see his family in Ohio. He meets a badass survivalist played by Woody Harrelson, and they do what amounts to the Odd Couple road movie routine as they fight off zombies and search for supplies. No amount of blood and guts can make a great movie. You need chemistry between the characters, and these two really have that down, as well as the two female leads, who they end up forming like a little post-apocalyptic surrogate family, played by Abigail Breslin and Emma Frost. While the film has some comedic leanings, it doesn't go full into Shaun of the Dead comedy kind of territory until the sequel in 2019. The comedy here is mixed with the horror and action elements which dominate the story, and it's easy when you attempt to do that to botch it, but Zombieland doesn't. The mix of laughs, gore, and buddy movie chemistry are just right. So, that's my zombie movies list. I had fun writing it, and in my research I found a whole bunch of movies I want to see. I remember seeing the covers for movies like Zombie Lake and Zombie Nightmare in the local video store back in the 80s, but I never got to see them, and I really want to now. I found a whole bunch of cool movies from Korea, Hong Kong, and Japan that look great. Also one from Thailand. There's even a Zombie Gladiator movie that came back clear out in the 60s. That looks pretty bad. So, did I miss any? What's your favorite zombie movie? Feel free to write it in the comments below, and thanks for watching.